Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into, well, a pretty thorny philosophical thicket. We're looking at the reliability of human reason itself. Can we actually trust our own thinking?
The fundamental question, really.
Our mission today is to tackle David Hume's idea of global skepticism head-on. That's the argument that reason is basically useless for figuring out anything real about the world.
Right. The idea that it's fundamentally incompetent.
And we're setting that against the counter-argument, often called the dogmatist view, which says, hold on, that skeptical argument actually destroys itself.
Exactly. We're diving deep into whether you can use reason, use rational argument, to prove that reason itself is fundamentally flawed. Can logic logically undermine itself?
It sounds like a snake eating its own tail. Or, I don't know, trying to saw off the branch you're sitting on.
That's a good analogy. Can the tool dismantle the tool maker using the tool itself? That's the core of it. We call the skeptical argument aiming for this, argument S.
Argument S, okay.
And before we dive into Hume's specific take, let's just clarify what we mean by global skepticism here.
Good idea.
It's the position that our reasoning abilities are just structurally incapable of reaching what philosophers call substantive conclusions about reality.
Substantive conclusions, like facts about the world, how things actually are.
Precisely. What Hume called matters of fact. Contingent claims, things that could be otherwise but happen to be a certain way, like this table is brown or the universe is expanding.
So the global skeptic isn't just saying maybe you're wrong about that. They're saying your entire method for deciding if the table is brown is broken.
Exactly. It's a much deeper claim. They argue we fundamentally lack substantive knowledge about how things really are in themselves.
Okay, but wait. Isn't the claim itself the claim that we can't have substantive knowledge? Isn't that a substantive claim about us? About our minds?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the central tension. The very conclusion of the global skeptical argument. This big statement that human reason is incompetent. Well, that statement looks like a massive, substantive, contingent fact about human beings and their cognitive limits.
Right. It's a knowledge claim about the limits of knowledge claim.
Precisely. It seems to rely on the very thing it denies.
So that's the big question for today, then. Does argument S, this skeptical argument, actually work? Does it manage to sort of borrow reason's authority just long enough to torpedo reason? Or is it, like, logically flawed from the get-go because of this self-contradiction?
That's the debate. And to figure that out, the dogmatist, the defender of reason, says we first need to understand what tools reason must rely on, what cognitive faculties are absolutely necessary just to do reasoning in the first place.
Okay, so what are these foundational tools, the ones even the skeptic has to pack in their toolkit?
The argument is, if we identify these essential faculties needed to evaluate any argument, including argument S, then the conclusion of argument S, that we lack reliable faculties, becomes impossible to actually affirm through reason. You can't use reliable tools to conclude your tools are unreliable.
It's like proving your eyesight is perfect by reading an eye chart that concludes your eyesight is terrible. The act of proving it contradicts the conclusion.
Exactly. The dogmatist argues it's a foundational, logical impossibility. So let's lay out these necessary faculties. The sources point to three key ones.
All right, number one.
First up is introspection. This is our direct, immediate awareness of our own mental states, our thoughts, feelings, sensations as they happen.
Just knowing what's going on in my own head right now.
Yes. And it's absolutely fundamental. Without it, how could you even grasp an argument to think about it? You couldn't be aware of the premises or the feeling of understanding or the conclusion popping into your mind.
It's like the screen on which the thoughts appear. If the screen's broken, you can't see the movie.
A perfect analogy. And introspection yields judgments, spontaneous judgments about our current mental state. And these come with a special kind of certainty. Extrinsic certainty.
Extrinsic meaning outside. Certainty about something outside?
No, quite the opposite in a way. The certainty isn't about whether the content of your thought matches the outside world. You might be thinking of a unicorn, which isn't real.
Right.
But you can be certain that you are currently thinking about a unicorn. The certainty is about the mental act itself, not its external object. It's incorrigible in that specific context. You can't be mistaken about what you're consciously experiencing right now.
Okay, that's a subtle but important point. I'm certain of the thought, not necessarily the thing the thought is about.
Exactly. And here's a kicker that challenges the skeptic directly. Introspection does allow us to grasp at least one crucial substantive contingent fact.
Which is?
I exist, and I am a self-conscious, rational subject currently thinking. The very act of introspecting confirms your existence as a thinking being right now.
Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," basically, derived from introspection.
In essence, yes. That immediate awareness is given with this extrinsic certainty. And if you can be certain of that, your own existence as a thinker, then you possess at least one piece of substantive knowledge.
And that single piece contradicts the global skeptic who says no substantive knowledge is possible. Okay, that's faculty 1. Introspection. What's number 2?
Number 2 is rational intuition. Now, this relies on introspection. You have to be aware of the ideas first, but its job is different. It's about directly grasping truth concerning what Hume called relations of ideas.
Relations of ideas, like logic, math, definitions.
Precisely. Things like logical validity. Does this conclusion really follow from these premises?
Yeah.
Mathematical truths, 2 + 2 = 4, or fundamental logical principles. There's something can't be both A and not A at the same time.
So introspection shows me the thoughts. Rational intuition judges the connections between those thoughts if they're logical, necessary connections.
You got it. And rational intuition allows us to grasp these abstract truths with intrinsic certainty.
Intrinsic this time. How's that different?
Intrinsic certainty comes from the content of the thought itself. Once you understand the concepts involved in 2 + 2 = 4, you see its truth directly. It doesn't depend on observation or context. It's true a priori, just based on understanding it.
Okay, so I just see that it has to be true.
Right. And without this faculty, how could we ever judge if an argument is valid? If argument S is presented as a logically sound proof, the skeptic is implicitly relying on our reliable rational intuition to recognize that validity.
Uh-huh. So they're using the tool again. They're asking us to trust our rational intuition, to accept an argument that concludes rational intuition can't be trusted.
It sets up that same deep conflict, yes.
Okay.
So we have introspection for awareness of thoughts, rational intuition for logical connections. But reasoning isn't instant. It takes time, right? You move from premises to a conclusion.
Yeah, it's a process, step by step.
Which brings us to the third necessary faculty, memory.
Makes sense. You need to remember the beginning of the argument by the time you reach the end.
Absolutely. All inference happens over time. You consider premises, thoughts you just had moments ago, and move to a belief or conclusion, a thought you're having now. To do that successfully, the thinking subject must be able to reliably retain the premises in their present thought.
If I forget the premises halfway through the argument,
then you can't actually judge if the conclusion follows from them. You're just evaluating the conclusion in isolation. The whole inferential chain breaks down.
So if memory is fundamentally unreliable, as a global skeptic might imply about all faculties, then no argument, including the skeptic's own argument S, could ever be judged as sound.
Precisely. You couldn't reliably hold the steps together. So the dogmatist lays out these three: reliable introspection, reliable rational intuition, and reliable memory. They argue you need all three just to understand, construct, and validate any argument, including the one that claims these faculties are unreliable.
It seems like a very tight logical trap. The argument eats itself before it even gets going.
That's the dogmatist's case in a nutshell. It makes skepticism seem impossible in principle.
But, and this is a big but, David Hume, arguably the most famous global skeptic, knew about these kinds of objections. And he didn't just dismiss them, he actually called this line of reasoning not just.
That's right. Hume's counter is fascinating because he doesn't try to find a logical loophole in the dogmatist's argument about these faculties. He essentially sidesteps the purely logical objection.
How? If the logic seems sound.
He shifts the whole ground of the debate away from abstract logical validity and towards empirical psychology. His argument relies on his new science of man, his theory of how our minds actually work, based on association of ideas and impressions.
So less about whether the argument is logically perfect, more about how it affects us psychologically.
Exactly. Hume offers a naturalistic account of how reason corrodes itself. It's not about a logical contradiction making the argument invalid from the start, but about a psychological process that gradually erodes our belief and confidence in reason.
Okay, this sounds different. How does Hume see belief and certainty working psychologically?
Well, first, forget objective probability for Hume. Probability for him is basically just a measure of our subjective expectation. How strongly do we anticipate something happening based on past experience?
So if I see the sun rise every day, I build up a very strong expectation. Probability approaches 1 for me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We project that feeling of anticipation onto the world, treating it like an objective feature. But for Hume, it's rooted in our psychology, our habits of mind.
Okay. And certainty.
Certainty is just the maximum level of that expectation. It arises from completely uniform observation, seeing A always followed by B without exception. That constant conjunction creates the strongest possible feeling of anticipation, which is what we call certainty.
So certainty isn't knowing something is absolutely true in reality. It's just having the absolute maximum confidence or expectation.
Psychologically speaking, yes.
Yeah.
And anything less than that absolute maximum anticipation is just belief, which comes in degrees. The stronger the expectation, the stronger the belief. The weaker the expectation, the weaker the belief. They're directly linked.
All right, so belief strength is tied to expectation strength. How does this lead to reason undermining itself, this diminution process?
Hume starts by acknowledging that reason initially holds absolute sway and authority. Think of basic causal reasoning. It feels completely certain based on our experience.
Like dropping a ball, I'm certain it will fall.
That's reason on the throne. But then the skeptic comes along, and the skeptic has to use reason too. They build complex, subtle arguments to show reason's fallaciousness and imbecility.
Using reason's own tools against it.
Precisely. The skeptical argument, argument S, has to be rational to have any force. Hume says it gets its power, its patent under reason's own hand and seal. It borrows reason's authority.
Like a rebel using the king's own decree to start a revolution.
Perfect. But here's the psychological twist. This skeptical patent, argument S, directly contradicts reason's original claim to absolute authority. You now have two opposing forces originating from the same source reason.
Okay, so reason says I'm reliable, and reason also says, via argument S, I'm unreliable.
Exactly. And Hume argues these two forces, being of the same kind, both rational arguments, but contrary in their effects, meet with equal force. They start to clash psychologically.
And what happens in the clash?
They gradually diminish each other's authority. Think of it like two waves canceling each other out. Neither side can gain ground without losing some itself. Every time you consider the skeptical argument, your confidence in reason's absolute authority takes a hit. But crucially, every time you rely on reason, which you must do to even entertain the skeptical argument, your confidence in the skeptical conclusion also takes a hit, because that conclusion denies the reliability of the very process you're using.
Wow, so they're locked in this sort of psychological mutual destruction.
That's exactly Hume's idea. It's a feedback loop where confidence just keeps eroding. He says this process continues till at last they both vanish away into nothing by a regular and just diminution.
So the end result isn't that one side wins logically, but that our feeling of certainty, our belief in reason, just gets completely shattered by this internal conflict.
Precisely. Reason effectively commits psychological suicide. We're left doubting everything, unable to trust our rational conclusions, and fall back on just instinct and custom to get by.
That's a much more subtle picture than just a simple logical contradiction. It explains that feeling of unease skeptical arguments can produce, even if you think you see a logical flaw. It works on your confidence.
It's a powerful psychological account. But the critics, the dogmatists, they say, okay, interesting psychology, Hume, but you're still ignoring the fundamental logical problem. They insist argument S is stillborn, logically, regardless of how it makes us feel.
Back to the logic then. The argument that the conclusion invalidates the process. This is where the nasty dilemma comes in, right?
Yes. The nasty dilemma is designed to show that argument S can never give us a good reason to accept its conclusion. It presents two possibilities, two horns, and argues both lead to failure for the skeptic.
Okay, let's take the first horn. Horn 1. Assume argument S is true. Assume the conclusion holds we really can't know any substantive facts.
Right. If S is true, then its own conclusion, we can know nothing substantive about matters of fact, is itself a substantive matter of fact about human knowledge. But if S is true, we can't know any such facts. Therefore, if S is true, I cannot know that S is true. The argument's own success logically prevents me from rationally affirming its conclusion.
It paints itself into a corner. If it's right, I have no rational grounds to believe it's right. It's a self-defeating knowledge claim.
Exactly. It achieves victory at the cost of making that victory rationally unknowable. Okay, now let's look at the other side.
Horn day say, assume I know S is true. This time, we assume the process worked. I successfully used reason, evaluated the premises and logic of S, and know it's a sound argument.
Right. So you're in a position to know via rational means that global skepticism is correct. But what does that imply?
Well, if I know that S is true based on rational argument, then I possess some substantive knowledge, the knowledge that S is true.
Precisely. You possess substantive knowledge concerning a matter of fact specifically the fact about the limits of human reason, but possessing any substantive knowledge derived rationally.
Entails that global skepticism is false, because global skepticism says we can have no such knowledge.
Exactly. So if you succeed in rationally proving S, your very success proves S false. It's a performative contradiction.
Wow. So, horn 1, if S is true, I can't know it. Horn 2, if I know S is true, then S must be false. Either way, argument S fails to provide a good reason to believe in global skepticism.
That's the power of the nasty dilemma. It argues that argument S is rationally inert. It can't achieve its goal. If the skeptic insists the conclusion is true, they have to admit the argument wasn't rationally compelling. If they insist the argument was rationally compelling, they have to admit the conclusion is false.
It seems airtight logically.
Yeah.
And the critique goes further, right?
Yeah.
Pointing out assumptions the skeptic makes even before getting to the conclusion.
Yes, digging into the presuppositions needed just to run argument S. There are 3 key ones that undercut the skeptical project.
Okay, first presupposition.
The reliability of judgment. In order to evaluate argument S, to judge its premises as true and its logic as valid, I have to assume, at least implicitly, that my general faculty of judgment is reliable enough for that task.
Makes sense. I have to trust my ability to judge arguments.
But if argument S then concludes that all my cognitive faculties, including judgment, are unreliable,
then my initial judgment that S was a good argument is thrown into doubt. I've used a supposedly reliable tool to conclude the tool is unreliable, which means I can't trust the conclusion I reached using it.
Exactly. It retroactively undermines the basis for accepting the argument.
Yeah.
It's viciously circular, like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstrap.
Okay, like that connects back to the dilemma. What's the second presupposition?
This relates to what we discussed earlier, the necessity of rational intuition, validity.
Right, judging the logical links.
Argument S needs to be logically valid to work as a rational proof. To recognize that validity, I need a reliable faculty, rational intuition, to grasp those necessary connections between ideas. But if S's conclusion is true, that I lack reliable faculties, then my rational intuition is unreliable. So I was never actually in a position to reliably judge S's validity in the first place.
So claiming my argument is logically valid, while concluding my faculty for judging logical validity is unreliable, is just contradictory.
It appears to be, yes. You affirm the tool in the process of denying the tool in the conclusion. And the third presupposition is perhaps the most common one we see in skeptical arguments.
Which is?
The knowledge of premises, truth. Think about how skeptical arguments usually work. They don't just float in abstract logic. They rely on specific claims about the world.
Like pointing out optical illusions, or that dreams feel real, or historical examples of scientific errors.
Exactly. Premises like perceptual errors occur. Our senses sometimes deceive us. Cognitive biases are widespread. These are presented as factual grounds for doubting our faculties. They are substantive, contingent, empirical claims.
They're presented as things we know to be true about our limitations.
Right. But if the conclusion of argument S is true, that we cannot have knowledge of contingent matters of fact,
then we couldn't possibly know the premises are true, because the premises are contingent matters of fact about perception and cognition.
Precisely. The skeptic needs to use known facts about faculty failures to prove we can't know any facts. It's a blatant contradiction. Accepting those premises as reliable enough to ground skepticism already presupposes the reliability of the very faculties, perception, memory, induction needed to establish those premises, that the conclusion seeks to deny.
You have to trust your senses enough to know your senses are untrustworthy.
That's the core problem. If your faculties are reliable enough to establish the truth of those skeptical premises, then the conclusion of global skepticism is simply false. The argument refutes itself by relying on premises that its own conclusion renders unknowable.
Okay, so putting it all together, the nasty dilemma, the undermining of judgment, validity, and premises, it really does seem like the dogmatist has shown that a rational argument for global skepticism is impossible in principle. It's logically self-destructive.
That's the strong conclusion from this line of critique, yes. It suggests Hume's psychological detour, while insightful, doesn't escape this fundamental logical problem.
So where does that leave us? We've got Hume saying reason psychologically eats itself, and the dogmatist saying any attempt to argue for that is logically doomed from the start. What's the upshot for someone just trying to figure out what's true?
Well, the first key takeaway is actually quite limited but important. The refutation of argument S shows that skepticism, as a rationally defended position, fails.
Meaning,
meaning the skeptic cannot provide us with a good rational reason to accept global skepticism. We can be confident that no argument like S could ever logically succeed in proving reason's incompetence. The attempt is structurally flawed.
So we don't have to worry about being logically forced into skepticism by an argument.
Correct. Reason itself demonstrates that a successful rational argument against its own authority is impossible in principle.
But you said the takeaway was limited. What's the catch? Does this prove reason is reliable? Does it prove dogmatism is true?
No. And this is crucial. Showing that the argument against reason fails doesn't automatically prove that reason succeeds. The failure of argument S does not logically entail that dogmatism, the view that we do possess substantive knowledge, is true.
Why not, if the only argument against it fails?
Because the failure of S only establishes that we can never have a good reason to believe dogmatism is false. It removes the rational objection to dogmatism.
Okay.
But it's still logically possible that global skepticism is, in fact, true. We might actually lack reliable faculties and substantive knowledge.
Even though we could never rationally prove it.
Yes, think about it.
Yeah.
If skepticism were true and our reasoning was fundamentally unreliable, then our inability to construct a sound argument for skepticism would be exactly what we'd expect. Our broken tools wouldn't be able to build a proof of their own brokenness.
Wow. Okay. So the truth of skepticism is actually consistent with the failure of argument S.
It is. The logical failure of the skeptical argument doesn't rule out the factual truth of the skeptical condition. It just means we could never rationally convince ourselves of it if it were true.
That leads us back to something you mentioned earlier, the starting point. The assumption that our faculties are reliable. How do we justify that?
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've been using reason, introspection, memory throughout this whole discussion, assuming they work. But can we prove they work without, well, using them?
Seems like we run into that circularity problem again, trying to prove my eyes work by looking really hard.
Exactly. Philosophers call it epistemic circularity, or sometimes invidious circularity. Any attempt to justify the fundamental reliability of our cognitive faculties, reason, perception, memory, seems inevitably to rely on those very faculties in the justification process.
You use memory to argue memory is reliable. You use reason to argue reason is reliable.
Right. You can show they are consistent, perhaps, but providing an independent, non-circular proof of their fundamental reliability seems impossible.
So, what does that mean? If we can't prove our basic tools work,
It means that the belief in the reliability of our cognitive faculties, the bedrock assumption required for any knowledge claim, any rational inquiry, including this one, remains ultimately an unprovable assumption.
an assumption.
In a deep philosophical sense, yes. It's a starting point we adopt. It's ultimately, you could say, a matter of faith.
Faith? Faith and reason, that sounds almost contradictory for philosophy.
Perhaps. But it seems to be the epistemic situation we find ourselves in. We have to adopt a foundational trust in our ability to connect with reality through our faculties. The dogmatist position, which assumes this reliability, is at least consistent with the possibility of knowledge and successful argument.
And we know from refuting argument S that no skeptic can provide a rational reason to abandon that faith.
Correct. The dogmatist doesn't need to fear a successful rational demolition of their starting point. But again, consistency and lack of refutation don't equal proof. The choice to trust our faculties remains a foundational commitment, a necessary presupposition for engaging in rational life.
So, to recap this deep dive, we started with the high-stakes reason's authority under fire from Hume's skepticism. We saw Hume's subtle psychological account of how reason might diminish itself through internal conflict.
Undermining confidence.
But then we turned to the logical critique, the nasty dilemma, and the problem of presuppositions, which seems to show that any rational argument for global skepticism is logically self-refuting, basically stillborn.
Right. Reason can defend itself against a purely rational attack aiming to prove its own total incompetence.
Yet that logical victory doesn't give us absolute proof that our faculties are reliable. That initial trust remains, well, an act of foundational faith.
A faith that the skeptic cannot rationally shake, but a faith nonetheless. It's the price of admission, perhaps, for any kind of inquiry or knowledge.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a really provocative final thought to wrestle with. If the very possibility of knowledge, the foundation of our rational lives, ultimately rests on this unprovable faith in our faculties, does that make all our knowledge claims inherently fragile, inherently weaker? Or, conversely, does the logical impossibility of a successful skeptical argument make that foundational faith not just necessary, but actually a justified starting point for living a coherent, rational life? Something to think about.